The Jewish Channel's Week in Review. A major columnist on Israel issues makes a major move. Dr. Ruth looks back, looking back with Art Spiegelman too, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now in this episode of the Week in Review. Hello and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. When it comes to making Israeli-Palestinian peace, the United States might be making not just the push, but the very plan itself. Media reports have suggested that Secretary of State John Kerry has not seen the movement that he thinks he needs to bring the two parties together to strike a deal, particularly regarding Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And now, many Israeli news sources are reporting that Kerry will be presenting a plan that will indicate the U.S. position for negotiations. Only the vaguest details of what the plan would be have leaked out, such as the basic idea of 1967 borders with land swaps as a baseline. Israeli and Palestinian negotiators have met more than a dozen times since the announcement of peace negotiations a few months ago. Meantime, a major outlet for discussing the Israeli-Palestinian situation from a Jewish left-wing perspective is closing. Open Zion, a project of the Daily Beast and edited by Peter Beinart, will end this year, as Beinart is scheduled to become a senior columnist for Israeli newspaper and website Haaretz on January 1st. He will also be writing for The Atlantic. But when it comes to surprising views on issues in Israel, many observers were taken aback at a recent brouhaha in which the modern Orthodox community seemed to present a split in how it views women's inclusion. B'nai Akiva schools in Israel are identified with the broader B'nai Akiva movement for religious Zionism around the world, though there's no official affiliation between the schools and B'nai Akiva organizations. Last week, the head of those B'nai Akiva schools suggested that the girls in those schools should protest against the women's prayer gathering for Women of the Wall. With many B'nai Akiva types in Israel and the U.S. broadly supportive of the Women of the Wall's efforts, and also often identified with more liberal modern Orthodox efforts to increase women's roles in public ritual, this led to immediate controversy. That controversy was only inflamed in a statement from the spokesperson for the B'nai Akiva school network, who told Haaretz that a protest by B'nai Akiva students would, quote, show that the Kotel or Western Wall belongs to the entire Jewish people and not just to the extremists of Women of the Wall. The effort by B'nai Akiva schools leaders was eventually canceled amid the controversy. In another example of how controversy at the Western Wall is shining a light on the different ideas of authentic and appropriate Jewish practice, an interview by Jewish agency head Natan Sharansky suggested an idea that is sure to inflame the passions of many. Sharansky, who was charged with finding a solution for egalitarian prayer at the Western Wall, told Haaretz, for the Kotel, the most important thing is to keep the most ancient Orthodox synagogue in the world in one piece. Describing an ancient Jewish holy site as historically belonging to any one denomination, even before a time when denominations existed, is sure to excite further controversy around the Western Wall. Moving on to an interesting sign of progress for Orthodox women, ultra-Orthodox 25-year-old Mindy Pollock was elected to the City Council of Montreal, Quebec in Canada. She is perhaps the first, or certainly a very rare example, of an ultra-Orthodox woman elected to a position of such standing. A Vishnitz Chassid, Pollock won despite the opposition of many ultra-Orthodox leaders and laypeople. But if more ultra-Orthodox are going to succeed in achieving elected office, they're going to need a foundation for civic education and probably some access to a library. Unfortunately for residents in the ultra-Orthodox enclave of Kiryas Joel in upstate New York, public library access has officially ended. Residents of the Satmar village will not be able to borrow books from libraries in neighboring towns. The president of the Monroe Free Library's Board of Trustees explained the decision, saying, quote, Kiryas Joel residents have not paid taxes toward the library or voted on library issues since 2005, when they entered into a contract exempting them from those taxes so that they could direct funds toward the construction of their own library, an initiative that never materialized. Of course, some of the Jewishly relevant books that occupy a great many libraries are those by Art Spiegelman, and particularly his graphic novel exploration of the Holocaust, Mouse. A new exhibit offers a retrospective of Spiegelman's career, as Christian Needham reports.
Art Spiegelman's impact on the artistry of comics is massive. His print legacy as one of the genre's greats assured nearly 30 years ago with the publication of his masterpiece, Mouse. But Spiegelman's larger body of work, and the artists and publications that influenced him, are just as important to understanding the technique of this Jewish master. And the Jewish Museum in New York has taken up the challenge by hosting Art Spiegelman's Comics, a retrospective. The show, which originated in France, has been adapted for a New York run that will last through March 23rd. And during a press preview this week, Spiegelman sat down with the museum's Ruth Bish to discuss his career and artistic influences, including his childhood discovery of Mad magazine while out shopping with his mother.
Mad is what did me in, and my mother really refused to get it for me because it was just one more whim as far as she was concerned, and she was on a tight allowance from my dad. But eventually the nagging was severe enough so that I got to bring it home. And the punchline to that particular comic strip is that I studied Mad the way other kids studied the Talmud.
Later, Spiegelman would use those lessons to embark on a career in comics, an avenue whose low status in the art world attracted him because it gave him room to experiment.
And yet sometime in the 70s when I was involved in the underground comics thing, I very consciously had this thought that we have to make a Faustian deal with the culture. Comics were already no longer a mass medium, and it seemed to me that, based on having read McLuhan, when something's no longer a mass medium or technology, it either disappears or becomes art. The idea was to make this deal where comics could be accepted into libraries, bookstores, university studies, and museums and galleries. In exchange for that, artists would then be able to sneer and say, the best comics are pornographic and on newsprint, but there'd be a medium from which to say that, as opposed to a steady erosion of comic books and comic strips becoming far less important than they had been 100 years earlier.
Spiegelman operated within the bounds of that bargain, using underground comics as a form of self-expression, including for his depictions of human atrocities.
I realized I was dealing with atrocity through media studies, not through my own life. And that was made possible by a very significant for me influence and cartoonist and friend, Justin Green, who really brought the idea of autobiographical content to comics. And it's what gave me permission to pursue what became the first 3-page Maus.
That particular work plays a large part in an exhibition packed with various paneled prints from Spiegelman's long career. To see more from Art Spiegelman's comics, now on display at the Jewish Museum through March 23rd, please tune into the full broadcast edition of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Christian. Coming up on the Jewish Channel this week is a new episode of our Women's Issues discussion show, The Salon. The panel for this episode included Dr. Ruth Westheimer, and here are some highlights.
So, Dr. Ruth, let's start with you for a moment.
Just because I'm the oldest one?
Not at all,
No,
because
okay.
there is so much going on in your life. You have this new play, you have other programs that you're doing. Tell us what's happening.
All right. First of all, the play near Broadway, Becoming Dr. Ruth, and Deborah Jorab plays me beautifully. It's about my life, it's about the Haganah, it's about everything that, not everything.
Not everybody can say that about their life.
Right, about the things that I wanted.
Is there a moment in the show that when you see it, it becomes very emotional for you?
Absolutely, because I talk about having been an orphan of the Holocaust. I talk about never having the opportunity to see my parents or grandparents or anybody from my family again. And there are moments that I have to say to myself, look, you're not reliving it, you are seeing it on stage.
I'd like to talk for a little bit about something that I think has been the topic of conversation for certainly everyone that I encounter in the Jewish community, and that is a new survey that the Pew Research Center just had published. We're seeing a lot of American Jews not feeling very religious at all.
I would say, as a very committed Jew and very committed to Israel, I go every year, that I think that the people that I meet, they are all involved in something where they try to get young people like you and your viewers to be part. And I think that that is something that is very positive.
Now we have to get to a really important topic. Questions about sex.
I know what she's thinking about.
That's
sex.
right. So here's what we're going to do.
Look how they all smile now. I would like to see Marie Claire to have an issue. And I'm willing to pose, but not naked. And I'm willing to pose in a nice negligee to show that older people should continue to be sexually active. It says so in our tradition. And I believe that you can be sexually active until the age of 90. And as Deborah Jorab says, that I'm raising that bar every year.
You can see the full episode of The Salon in its category under TJC Original Series on the Jewish Channel On Demand on cable. Finally, the topic of women's inclusion in prayer is perhaps no more heartfelt than at times surrounding the prayer for mourners, the Kaddish. A new anthology gathers the experiences of women who've performed that prayer as a remembrance for parents, siblings, and children. The two editors of Kaddish, Women's Voices, Michal Smart and Barbara Ashkenazi, stopped by TJC studios to discuss what women shared with them. Here are the highlights from that interview. Right, and there are a number of people, you've got this anthology of, I would get, it's somewhere in the range of 40-plus writers, right? So some people are writing twice in these 52 pieces, and a number of them share stories about some opposition they had when trying to deliver this mournful prayer for their parents or loved ones.
That has been true in some of the essays. On the one hand, some men have been very uncomfortable with the presence of women in their daily minyanim. On the other hand, some men have been wonderfully welcoming and warm and supportive and embracing the women who come on a daily basis.
Well, what are some of the stories that you've heard kind of on both ends? Starting with, what are some of the stories you heard? Were there stories that you received that you were shocked by, or genuinely surprised by?
You know, we read enough of these stories that we said at some point nothing will shock us, and then we get one in and say, oh my God, you have to read this.
So what was one of those?
You know, there are stories that I would characterize as more benign neglect. Women who come day after day and the lights are never turned on in the women's section. I don't think that's anyone deliberately trying to be hurtful, but somehow there's an invisibility sometimes that a woman experiences coming to a daily minyan. And then you can have other examples, you know, where someone is literally being screamed at by someone as she's trying to pray and to recite the Kaddish. What are you doing here? You have no reason to be here. You're ruining my own davening. Men coming into the women's section, men putting chairs and barricades around a woman so they won't see her while she's trying to concentrate and to daven.
And then are there stories that you've heard on the other end of the spectrum, things that just made you feel warm and fuzzy?
Absolutely.
Not so many?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
No, there's many, many, many.
There are congregations where women are welcomed with warmth, where someone inquires, you know, who did you lose, and I'm so sorry, where the tzedakah box is very deliberately and conscientiously passed to the women's side as well, where people are welcomed and supported. Thank God. I mean, I think that's becoming, hopefully, more and more the case.
You gathered a lot of stories and certainly have had a lot of feedback as well from people who are not Orthodox. And to what degree are there issues of acceptance and issues of equality there as well?
I think women are generally very accepted in the Reform and Conservative to say Kaddish and to be included in the count for the minyan.
Those
overall.
women confronted other challenges, which was where am I going to find an egalitarian daily minyan, which can support me in saying Kaddish, not because they would be opposed to it, but because they don't exist.
Did you hear from any women who felt like after an experience like that, maybe this certain community I'd been choosing before is no longer a community for me? Maybe I need to adjust my thinking about what kind of community I want to be a member of?
Absolutely. There are stories of women who picked up and moved to a new community through the experience of saying Kaddish. In some ways, it was because they found the experience so religiously meaningful that they wanted ritual and tradition to become a greater part of their lives. And they realized they wanted to be closer to a synagogue or an observant community of some kind.
You can see the full interview with Michal Smart and Barbara Ashkenazi in the interviews category under TJC Original Series on the Jewish Channel On Demand on cable. That's all for this week from all of us here at the Jewish Channel. Be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 528, IO Optimum Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, Cox Cable Channel 1, Frontier Communications, and on Comcast in the on-demand menu under premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.